So I want to thank you all for joining us today. We have the pleasure of talking together with Christine MacMillan, and we're going to talk with her about a guidance document that the Salvation Army, the Humanitarian Disaster Institute at Wheaton College, and the Human Trafficking Commission under Christine's direction have recently produced. And I am going to invite Christine to kind of give us an overview of the thinking behind that document. We'll share the document online. And then I want to invite all of you to join together in a conversation with Christine about what we see as the use of this document and ideas people might have to help us to get the greatest benefit out of this, including how to distribute it or any other suggestions or guidance that we might provide people along with this. So I just want to say briefly, Christine really comes to this with a wealth of experience. Her career is largely with Salvation Army in several countries, and she has a long history of working in the field of human trafficking. So I think she brings a tremendous background and experience to this whole topic of human trafficking. And so I want to encourage you to, if I can put Christine on the spot just a little bit, but to take advantage of that if you particularly have questions regarding the issue of human trafficking in the context of COVID-19. She's going to share through this guidance document a little bit about how COVID-19 really increases the risk to this vulnerable population. But let's also engage her a bit in a conversation about how might we best understand the needs of that population. So with that, Christine, I'm going to unmute you, and maybe there we go. So
unmuted.
If you're ready, I'll go ahead and will you tell me when you're ready and I'll share the document.
I'll do an introduction before you share the document, but I'm really grateful that we're together discussing this issue. And the process has come to us from a request. Since 2009, as David mentioned, the Human Trafficking Task Force for the World Evangelical Alliance. Our membership of our task force is on every continent of the world, and they work in their own settings, and they then form the task force that allows us to look at the contextualization of our settings and then an overall global framework. The objectives of the task force are, first of all, I think not to be seen as an NGO or non-governmental organization, but to work through the local church. And so we have provided a biblical foundation for our engagement, and all this can be referred to in the website, which I'll identify later. We encourage the telling of stories on human trafficking experiences, and then getting other people to listen. And out of those stories, we develop strategic networks to information, to prayer, and to, I would say, very importantly, the whole subject of prevention as churches working in local communities. As we identify and we develop those resources for the local church, we then ask them to be strategic in what part they can play in their own local community, which could be advocacy with their government bodies, trying to develop an ensured way in which the law has an ability to arrest traffickers and so forth. And then we take all these responses and we mobilize them with training through regional trainers in networking and partnerships. The task force itself also has influence by virtue of where people sit outside of the task force. I myself I'm a member of the Multi-Faith Advisory Council for the United Nations. I sit on a number of boards, and one particularly, which has a hub, a multi-faith board on trafficking, where research is critical, and they're producing those documents. And so as we begin to look at the actual resource itself, let me say to you that the member of the Salvation Army that participated in this and the person who's identified from Wheaton are all members of our global task force. And we could have had one brand, but we chose to identify different brandings of members of our task force, so then we can get out those resources into the community and their own networks of influence. And so as you look at the document, and David, I'm going to ask that you put it up on the screen now. We'll just wait for that. Here it comes. So you'll see then the three brandings, but really the impetus came from the WA task force, with others then coming in with their own brand as members. And one of the things we've discussed in our meetings together is who are the vulnerable populations we need to look at and become aware of. And you'll see here three vulnerable populations mentioned: child maltreatment, human trafficking, and intimate partner violence. I want to suggest to you that right from the beginning, do not expect that only deals with one gender. That could be male victims of human trafficking, as well as female, as well as children. And in the introduction of the document itself, we want to identify those populations so we begin to understand their unique needs. And the uniqueness of this population of human trafficking is it can be very hidden. So in some ways, when we talk about social distancing, perhaps trafficked people are already socially distant from us as a society. And our task force is very engaged in intervention strategies at what I would say some risk to themselves as well. So when we look at the response and identifying again that gender is not restricted to females, although almost 0.75% of trafficked victims are those in the commercialized sex trade, which are mainly women. But on our task force, and I thought this would be of interest to you, we are not restricted to women only as representatives. We have 2 men on our task force who they themselves will take a resource like this and they will start the conversations with leaders in their community who could be mainly men and who need to identify this issue in the circle of their influence. So I'm wondering in that introduction, Dave, if there are any questions even now before we walk through some of the ways in which we want to become aware. And any questions from anyone? Okay, well, let's continue. I think you're going to find in this document that it's not in any way restricted to people who are being in the trafficking experience at present. But we are looking at ways in which people who have experienced trafficking are also being affected by COVID-19. First of all, we talk about isolation. And these are ways in which we learn and identify peculiar and particular ways in which trafficking victims or those in intimate partner violence look at isolation. We acknowledge the fact it may remind survivors of trafficking of the experience and the emotions that they had, and it brings them back to that place of trauma. So we encourage church communities and communities at large to become aware of the fact that people's own stories of the past may be triggered by COVID-19. We know as well that we've talked about in our group together, the lack of an ability to connect with people who are not, for example, on virtual communication. And so we often identify traffickers as getting their information for one source only, and that's traffickers and that's exploiters. And even the people that they serve, their customers, are not engaging with them with outside information. They're mainly being used. And so people's information base is very limited. And that again, when there's an awareness of something going on that's bigger than themselves and that things have shifted in their own lifestyle, then the lack of control and the desire for reliable information is even more, they are even more threatened by being hidden under trafficking or hidden under their experience of having been trafficked. In which people live a lifestyle of trafficking is under what we call rules and recommendations. They are highly controlled. They are controlled to the extent where their trauma continues. And as we look at the way in which this is under point 3, there's expectations of them that perhaps are being interpreted now as a reminder of the expectations of social distancing and COVID-19. And so what has been enforced, rigid and unrealistic rules, are making former victims of trafficking and victims now even feeling more out of control and insecure and not knowing what they're supposed to do, what their expectations are at this point. And so we're almost getting this incremental sense of their own experience through these points that are being made. And in some cases, these points might even be transferable to other vulnerable populations. So as we look at now point 4, increased abuse and threats, life has changed. We begin to see that as victims may be spending more time with their traffickers who are frustrated because the customer base has obviously lessened because of the fear of contracting COVID-19 themselves as customers. Then what does that do? So there's economy of scale as well in trafficking that's being affected. And they are, the trafficked are living out this abuse and this threat. Exhaustion and fear. I was talking to my psychologist friend in Australia recently, and he said, and this applies to all of us on this call, he said, they're discovering that people that are on a number of Zoom calls are far more exhausted than getting on a plane and going to an event. There's something that's exhausting people with this way of communicating and lack of personal engagement. But some of the exhaustion and fear is coming for those whose life is at risk, lack of access to food and medical care. And so they are already exhausted by their lifestyle and by being forced to be engaged in either labor trafficking, commercial sex trafficking, and the list goes on. But there's an increasing fear and exhaustion because of lack of resources. I was on a call and the comment was made, which I'm sure you've heard, that we're not so much now afraid of dying of COVID-19 as dying of hunger. And I think the very practical day-to-day lifestyle is a increased feeling of exhaustion and fear for trafficking victims. And then the financial abuse. I'm sure that trafficking victims, and as I meet with our task force in the next couple of weeks, there will be very creative ways in which, through COVID-19, traffickers will exploit even more these victims. We do know that trafficking itself, it somehow builds itself on events and environments and atmosphere. For example, looking at sporting events, there's always trafficking victims brought to sporting events because there's a big market with people gathering for these events. And so, believe me, the traffickers will be very creative in finding ways to keep their own pocketbooks lined. Now, this might be a surprise to you, but parenting, that those who co-parent their children or are still being trafficked, we're seeing then the increased pressure on accessible childcare, and the children themselves, who are already in a very vulnerable situation with their parent, are being exploited as well. Internet abuse obviously is going to increase. There's no physical touch, there's no physical engaging in getting contracting COVID-19. So we are in the midst, and it should be coming out in a week. Our group is putting together a tip sheet on parents and their children and the threat of internet abuse, and the ways in which their children can be coerced, or their teens, or people in general, in becoming victims of internet abuse. Now, you'll see then the recognition of the contextualization for Canada and the US. But in effect, that in a Word document can allow the person who uses this to engage their own resources or their own hotlines or who to call. And that pretty much is walking through the document. It is not meant to all of a sudden have churches say, we're going to start a mission on human trafficking. It's to create an awareness of a vulnerable population. And we have noticed that when awareness increases, then things are seen. People pick up on these things. And it would be, at our human trafficking task force and our global partners, which is 40 persons who just gathered in Toronto in March, are already connected to their communities and national alliances, and will then be helping interpret a document such as this under the banner of COVID-19. I think I've probably said enough, and I welcome and open the Zoom call for discussion.
Thank you, Christine. Let me stop the share here a moment. There we go. Yeah, that's a good overview, and I think it does just what you said in terms of making us more aware of the variety of issues related to trafficking. Just quickly, it reminds me of a couple semesters ago, I was teaching a class at Northwest Nazarene on humanitarian issues, and a couple of students did their term paper on human trafficking right here in Idaho, thinking, quiet little Idaho, this isn't an issue here, this is a New York issue. And they were astounded that just by asking questions and digging a little bit deeper, that human trafficking, in fact, was an issue, right here in quiet little Idaho. And so when we think about engaging churches, are we, with this, perhaps trying to get churches to become more active? Not just passively wait and, gee, if I see somebody who looks like they're being trafficked, then maybe I would do something. But like those students, to get out and dig a little bit deeper, scratch below the surface, try to find out more of what's going on. I mean, in a sense, is that the first thing we're asking churches to do?
We can be, yes. And there are wonderful resources for people to understand their own nation as to what is the level of trafficking in their country, whether it's a sending country, if it sends victims, if it's a destination country, the nature of trafficking, whether it's labor, and so we can point to that, and we can provide those resources for you online to become familiar with your own contextualized nature of trafficking. And we have discovered that understanding it also then has the church become aware of what do we need to do to prevent this. So under normal circumstances, we recommend that Sunday school teachers are trained in trafficking so that kids themselves can be aware of the ways in which, particularly outside their schools, they're going to be brought into this horrible practice. And what we are saying is it's like anti-smoking campaigns. The more you become aware and the more you understand what it does to the community and who's involved, things begin to that awareness and prevention is power. It actually gives people a sense of what could happen, because traffickers are very well schooled. So let's say someone leaves home and they're on the street. I will guarantee you that traffickers within 24 hours in many nations will have spotted that person, have engaged with them, not under the banner of trafficking, but can I help you? And then get them caught into that web of human trafficking. And so we're suggesting that at this point, that it might be a way of engaging on a topic that you haven't necessarily thought of, even with this sheet, and to look at prayerful ways. We have prayer guidance and whatnot, and to even pray for what you can't see. And then to connect with those people in your community that are working in this field and giving them your support and listening to what they're grappling and dealing with. So one of the ways in which this topic becomes even broader and wider is in a multi-faith context. So I guarantee you, if you look at this document, there's no reason why someone of a different persuasion of a faith expression could not use this. And what we're finding that trafficking creates a collaborative spirit, because it is so horrific that people come together to want to do something about it. So digging, yes, creating the awareness, finding it's in your community, but also engaging with people who they themselves are working in this field would be a wonderful support by the church. And then they will tell the church, what is it is needed. And they will, to have that support will again create new awareness.
So perhaps we could even think in terms of taking what you just described in kind of a companion guide, because I, in my own note-taking, identify 4 steps you just described. So the church coming together prayerfully, is this something that we need to be paying attention to? You know, should this become part of our ministry to the community? Then to educate themselves. And interestingly, you suggest even educating children. I'd like to come back to that later. Connecting the community, those who are working in this area. So networking with the whole community becomes important. And also to think in terms of an interfaith context, work across faith groups as an extension of that networking. And I would point out in many ways that's similar to what we've described in other aspects of COVID-19. You know, for example, partnering with health facilities, get out there and network, work across groups, educate yourselves. Yeah, so.
And I think that the 5th thing, David, was to look at the trigger points. So how, as human trafficking, you know, every time I go out and speak or I'm involved in UN meetings or wherever, there are trigger points to this topic. They might not necessarily relate to a human trafficking experience, but it could be an abuse experience. And you might find that people want to talk under the banner of COVID-19. And how can they talk with a way in which they understand confidentiality, in which they are not being sort of reinfected, I would say, not with COVID-19, but with their own experience. And so the church has an opportunity. I'm with my own church. I have so many names I'm to call, and I go to a mission church where the homeless live in Toronto, Canada. And I am learning more stories about people who want to talk about their lifestyle of the past, their struggles with the present, and we're praying on the phone. And so when I go back to that congregation, I will know people in a far deeper way. And so, you know, you could even use this resource and say, what is this saying to you? Have a conversation. It creates an awareness that I think we want to come out of post-COVID-19, God willing, in ways that are authentic relationships, because trafficking is not an authentic relationship. And one of our male human trafficking resource persons, Martin Kupenda, has written a whole course and working with men and being aware of how do we engage in an atmosphere that encourages probably non-respectful communication, even in the church. And so, you know, we might not get out there as some big heroes and rescuing everybody and kicking down doors of brothels, but this is about relationships and trauma and God-given relationships. And I think I was just on a Micah Global call with the staff, and we're talking about building trust in our relationships and how people are coming to us with their fears and their anxieties and trying to find God, you know, in the difficult suffering of life.
Yeah, good points. Let me invite the rest of the group. Let's engage some more people in the conversation. So I can unmute people. There we go. And so if folks have questions or comments, go ahead and dive in.
Is this helpful? Like, you know, I look for feedback as well. So, see, it's a hard topic to talk about, isn't it?
Christine, this is Manuel. I think it is very, very helpful. I sent that resource directly to a friend that is very much engaged, hands-on with people working in that industry. And it made her immediately think of what she could do and pulling together her team and considering what they could do now right away. So I think it is very, very helpful. Thank you very much. I think the focus on awareness and making people think about that the COVID situation is suddenly putting people at even higher risk, I think that's a very good, important emphasis. And now pointing back to the church, I really think it's very important that we figure out how to integrate that on the web page and help people to really understand that this topic, human trafficking, is something that happens all around us. I think people are so prone to not look at it and do not expect this to happen in their surroundings. But yeah, I mean, it is happening everywhere. So thank you very much, Christine.
I want to thank you, Christina. I've got several networks in Calcutta working with sex trafficking there. And what you've indicated here is information that I've not seen before, particularly in terms of the pastoral care issues. There's not a whole lot they can do at the advocacy level because of the political structure there, but the pastoral care issues, this is very helpful. Thank you. Yeah.
Well, let me share with you that part of the document was on the development of this was Ashima Samuel, who is as you know, works with the National Alliance in India and is a lawyer herself and is very much involved in the development of this document.
Okay.
And she will use it well. So I don't know if you know Ashima.
I know who she is, yes.
Yeah, okay. Well, she will be encouraged by a word from you.
Okay, good. Thank you.
Yeah, great. Yes, to my side. Hello?
Hello?
Yeah, yes, I say to my side, just after I followed correctly the debate, a church really, to my side, I guess that the church is really the basic of everything. As you know, most of people in the world, they go to church. As either you are a Christian or you are a Muslim, for example, but all people go to church. And then I think the church could just own this matter so that they can teach to different people, so that the people can avoid to deal with traffic. Even this this problem of COVID-19, the church should be well placed at teaching people, because most of people, Christians, believe in their pastors than believing in anyone else. This is what can be my suggestion. We as task force, after this, we should, if possible, we could get just a newspaper, something like a newspaper that can be given to most of churches after the pandemic period. This can be distributed to different churches so that people can start teaching Christians. Pastors can be much involved in teaching people. As they teach people to avoid sins, they should also teach people to avoid things as traffic. Thank you very much.
Well, I really appreciate your comment.
But I've got a question.
Yes.
Yeah. Then, as you know, here in Congo, in the Democratic Republic of Congo, I am a Christian, a Protestant. I used to go to church, but the same person who did bad things to people yesterday in the city, is the same person you can see in the church. And there are some pastors, yes, really, there are some pastors who are somehow involved in traffics. There are some pastors of some fucking churches, especially in developing countries. There are pastors, he comes, he starts a church today, tomorrow he goes up and he eats offerings. He is there to get offerings, to get money from Christians, and then he is preaching the word of God. And I don't know, just even from people just participating in this task force, then what can be suggested so that this can be stopped?
Yeah. So you are exactly right. And this is not just in developing countries, this is everywhere. And we think that bringing this topic to the church has the church look at itself. every church needs a policy around abuse in the church. And I've been as leader of the Salvation Army in Canada and Papua New Guinea, and you have these policies. And we know that a pastor holds a lot of power. And so as we look at COVID-19, it's perhaps asking us to change some of our policies, even around power. And so how can it be stopped? My question would be, how is that pastor accountable? How does the church become comfortable with that conversation to sit down and say, I see you here Sunday, with a group of people who are aware, but I see you doing something else on Wednesday. And so this topic actually brings a conscience to the church. And we're very, very aware of that. We're Christians, and I will say to you, it's been very difficult for some of our task force members to introduce this topic in some of our church affiliations. They don't want to hear about it. And so let us take this as, a word from God in some ways, that we are to be holy people as well. And our best influence is when we ourselves live what we preach. And you don't want to get involved in trafficking. And one of the ways in which we ask people to get involved in this is to take a way of thinking for themselves, is do we serve with clean hands and clean hearts? So post COVID-19, we could have another discussion on how do we make our own trafficking task force even of more influence in more of the churches, with some of our people in Africa, in South America, in India. So I think maybe we begin to park some of these things with accountability, and to look at the power of church people to say, yes, we can do this.
Yeah, that's I would suggest even was talking about traffic as even today, this morning here in Democratic Republic of Congo, because of traffic, there is a Ugandan who came with his goods to come to sell in Congo. As far as all borders are locked, no passage, but he trafficked and he passed with his goods, and he came to Congo and he entered with coronavirus and has been tested positive. Then if churches were just functioning, people should consider traffic as a sin. Most of people, they don't consider traffic as sin. It is as a business. And then if pastors can take this matter and teach to different people, knowing that making traffic is a sin, and then it can give a good impact to different Christians who can listen to the pastor. Thank you.
I think Raghu had a comment or question.
Yeah, thank you, Christine, for that wonderful presentation. It's really helpful, really insightful. Just a comment, though human trafficking is not been a huge issue in Sri Lanka. But I was just wondering, some of these awarenesses, how we can take it to the community. Now, just for an example, we use the World Without Orphans parenting guidelines, which we have, the translation is available in almost all the languages. We print those and we distribute, when we distribute our relief packs, we put one of these parenting guidelines also into those relief packs. So it reach out to the community at large. The grassroots community gets those awareness messages in their own language. So I think that could be something, we can try it out to disseminate this information to wider community.
Can I share a story with you? I've been to Sri Lanka teaching, and Salvation Army pastors from around South Asia. And I was taken to a Salvation Army center where there were very many different groups of people. And the one group, I was brought into a room and there was all kinds of loud music playing. And I had my white Salvation Army uniform on. And at that time I was working in New York with the UN and the Salvation Army International Social Justice Commission. When the teenage girls heard I was from New York and I had on this white Salvation Army suit, they went crazy. And they said to me, "Would you dance with us?" This is a story that has broken my heart and has helped me so much. And I discovered that the only way they could dance was sexually. They were girls who were taken at 5 years of age from Sri Lanka and sent to the Middle East. And they were brought back as teenagers, and the government gave them to the Salvation Army to look after. They were so damaged that I said to myself that day, prevention, prevention, prevention. And so you might want to contact the Salvation Army and find out what's going on. But what I'm saying is this document, I think it's professional, it's not threatening, and it starts conversations going. And that's how I would use it. And it's not restricted to a Christian group of people. We did that intentionally. So I would share it with some people you know and see what they think. And language is very important as well. But I would start the conversation slowly and with those who are working in the area and say, how can we begin to look at this? It actually helps deal with persecution as well, because it is so horrific that it helps people say, well, maybe this is one thing we can agree upon.
Thank you.
Manuel had a question.
Yes, I have kind of like two questions. I'm very much trying to get down to earth, Christine. I really like that this is very confined and really focusing on the awareness part. But now I'm wondering, how do we get it down to the ground? So thank you, Raghu, for bringing in some of the ideas with handing out material. Two questions. How do we boil it down to the impoverished context? So last night I watched a documentary on the Yazidi girls being taken into human trafficking by ISIS fighters, that type of stuff. So how would we reach such girls in a refugee camp that have been in the context before, but now no one sees them maybe? So how do we get in the very impoverished communities, refugee camps, so the very specific context? That's the first question. But then the second one is, how do we come down from the awareness level to something maybe like a toolkit, maybe something down to the mission of the church? So in your working group from the past, what have you done that you could see or suggest now in the COVID situation? What infrastructures could we use? What are the practical ways? I know that MICA Germany has established working groups. I know that IJM has those ambassador programs. So what would be an adaptable program that we could kind of like maybe put on the web page or say, hey, people, this is the awareness document and here's the follow-up. So here's how you could actually do it and run something.
Well, we would work with so that's why we have task force members who work with local communities. So this is a complex issue. It's not like if you want to become a doctor, you don't put the 8 courses onto. So part of this needs, we do have those resources, but we work in the context of people who are skilled and working with the church. And I think if there's interest, like we've got the WA website there, they can write that and they will direct that to me. And then we will create these connections. I'll tell you something, we're just developing a new website. We're going to launch it in about a month because we're on the website for the WA and it's very outdated right now. Some of our people cannot be so identified They can be identified in a location, but not necessarily by name. And so I think if this is creating an interest, then we will deal with, you can direct them to the WA website, and they can write and say they're interested in this. And then we will do the connecting points with the task force. Now, with respect, like we're talking about a huge issue, so we don't want to train people online. This is for COVID-19, but every national alliance knows about the task force, and so if there's an interest, then incrementally we will develop with those groups. I'm not sure that COVID-19 setting is the time to start a ministry on human trafficking but it could be, again, connecting with those who do it in the community and how can the church help. And then you take the city situation. Well, our refugee highway partnership is working with that. So we're all connected, we're interconnected. And human trafficking is not in and of itself an issue. It's the result of other issues. And so it takes a lot of insight and training and awareness. And we would also suggest that local churches need to start off. We have a way in which they get involved by starting off with prayerfully, how does God want them to get involved in this? And we have some resources, we can work with them, not unlike Micah Global, an integral mission, that you gradually warm up to this, because it's a topic that's very sensational. And I saw somebody come on with Tear Fund. Like, there are a number of organizations that work in this field. And can I suggest to you, Manuel, I'm stepping back from putting the whole kit out there at this point under the banner of COVID-19. I hope we can see the wisdom of that, but it's not to say we're not going to connect with people who are interested. We've had National Alliance topics, workshops held around the world for people to get involved. And if they want to get involved, there's ways and means we can make those connections.
If I may just follow up on that a second, I think that one of the things that's really important for the local church is that any work with vulnerable people begins with seeing them. You need to see who's around you. I mean, I think of the parable of the Good Samaritan. The first step wasn't bandaging wounds and taking him to a place of rest. It was seeing that that person was there and was in need of help. And so we need to be engaged enough and have enough of a relationship with the community that we can see those who are in need, including those who are being trafficked, those who are being abused, those that are starving, whatever the case may be. The first thing is to have enough of a relationship with your community that you actually see these people.
Can I suggest that some of the ways in which you see people is asking what is needed? So there are a number of excellent NGOs working in this field. But when I've met with government leaders on this topic around the world, they say, well, we've got a law now in place, but our justice people are terrified to go out and do raids. And I'll say, why? And they'll say, because we've got all these screaming people on our hands, and what are we going to do with them? And so what we started to do was to offer, and we trained chaplains to go with the police on the topic of trafficking to intercept all the emotion that was being created by this intervention of justice, so to speak. It needed a human face, and it needed a sense of a semblance at the even at the police department. And so, but we work with churches and their giftedness and what God wants them to do. I've been in Jamaica where a whole church had their youth department of 50 kids write a play on trafficking. And I went to the play at night. It was a Methodist church, an hour. music, script. It was fabulous. And so what I'm saying is there's so many creative ways to get involved with the proper introduction and training. And not only awareness of the topic, but awareness of what you can do and what you cannot do. That's as important.
Yeah, yeah. While other folks are thinking about other questions that they may have, I'd like to take just a moment and follow up on Mapenzi's comment about the pastor who themselves were involved in trafficking women. And obviously, you know, and I think as you said, Jim, that's not unique to Africa or any other part of the world. But it's also true that every country has a few pastors who are powerful people, and a few of those misuse that power. In the Congo, that may be a pastor who has tribal connections and a lot of power from that. In the West, it may be a pastor who's connected to very wealthy or politically connected people and draw a lot of power from that. And they're more likely to hold on to that power when those who could counter that are fragmented and isolated. And so I think the first step in responding to the situation that Mapenzi described is that those of goodwill need to come together. The churches need to come together. You describe policies. Write down what is the expectation as far as trafficking or abuse, and be willing to hold each other accountable to that. And when I think people of good faith and goodwill work together, they can begin to counter those who have power and misuse that power. So, any other comments or questions for Christine? Christine, did you have any questions for the group that you would like to put out there, or perhaps after that, any closing comments?
Yeah, I think what is being made aware of our society at large is that the most vulnerable people are becoming highlighted, or there's an imagery of vulnerability that we've never seen before under the banner of COVID-19. We know that, for example, in the US, the majority of deaths are with the Black and brown populations. We know in my country of Canada that 79% of deaths are in our long-term care, seniors in long-term care. And I am suggesting that how do we part these issues in such a way that we as the church have a deeper conscience of vulnerability in our societies, such as trafficking, such as the aged, such as racial discrimination. And I'm trying to create within my own life a sense of what's important to continue. And so my suggestion that exists, does that mean we drop all the vulnerability? But what I'm also noticing that the vulnerability is making people angry. So that as we look at our people in the West, look at their investments and their bank balances and losing all the money, that the economy of vulnerability is creating even more of a disconnect in our societies. And so how do we as people of justice, because God loves justice, after these meetings continue, what is the conscience of the church because of COVID-19? And how do we do things differently? And that I think is, we could talk about trafficking, we talk about refugees, we could talk about racial discrimination, we could talk about poverty. And I think that these things are becoming even more highlighted. And I'll just share a lasting image And I think imagery is a good thing for us to think about. But on our Micah Global call, we had presentations. And one of the presentations was from Epicor out of India, the National Alliance Social Service Arm. And there was a picture of migrants. And the picture of migrants, they were obviously visibly, their clothing was tattered, poor. And there was one young man with a child on his shoulders. And the presenter was saying, these are migrants who no longer can find food in the cities. There's no more jobs for them of low income in homes and whatnot, home help. And he said that these migrants are making a choice to die at home rather than to die in the cities. And he said they're on their way now to walk home. And the home distance was 2,000 miles. And it just struck me as the ways in which we're living with this is different for so many people. And how do we choose, life instead of death? How do we choose hope instead of despair? Forgiveness instead of hate? And humility instead of pride? Because I think vulnerability asks us to be the character of Jesus in ways that we can be generous in our thoughts and our thinking and say, well, I hope you walk 2,000 miles and get home. I know you won't. But how do we create practicality out of that? But almost, a lament and a desire to give more of ourselves and the way we live for others.
Well, thank you for that, Christine. Thank you for those inspiring thoughts. Let me offer up a word of prayer as we close. Well, Lord, we really thank you for Christine, that you have blessed all of us with her being with us and sharing her experience and sharing her insights. And that we just really ask, Lord, that you would create a heart of awareness and mercy among the churches, that they would see those who are in need, seeing the vulnerable, seeing those who are being trafficked, seeing those who are being abused. And let those of us who would support those churches see how we can be of service to them and helping to create that awareness and create that response. So again, we thank you for this time today. We thank you that we have the opportunity to serve and that it is a blessing for us all. Take care of everyone and keep them in good health this week. Amen. Thank you, everyone. We will we'll meet again in 2 weeks. This is recorded. I'm going to